presentation is a hard act to follow, but I'll do my best. So we're at a conference that invites us to celebrate and develop sociality, which is a worthy aim. Deficiencies in sociality and the adverse consequences of those are all too apparent, even amongst personal construct psychologists. So although it's a worthy aim, I think a few words of caution are in order, lest we succumb to a view of sociality which is as cosy as that has been taken of the related concept of empathy. Now, I'm a good personal construct psychologist, so I don't deny that sociality is a necessary part of forming a role relationship with another person. The reverence with which role relationships are talked about in the personal construct literature, including the capitalization of the word role, might imply that role relationships are always caring and compassionate. Sociality indeed is a necessary prerequisite for a saint, a psychotherapist, a lover. But it's also necessary for a successful bully, a torturer, a sadist, a groomer of children, or any cynical manipulator of public opinion, advertisers, politicians. And it's this darker side of sociality that I want to focus on today. But even in more benign relationships, sociality can become oppressive. Imagine saying, oh no, she's construing my construction processes again. Or if you're the person doing the construing, if you always successfully construe your partner's construction processes, what a boring relationship, lacking in mystery it may become. So, some years ago, I decided to slot rattle from doing research on serial killing to doing research on love. And one of the findings was that people's construing of their romantic partners was significantly more conflictual than their construing of platonic friends. So the implication there is that for a romantic relationship, one needs the excitement that a bit of unpredictability gives you. If you feel that you can always accurately or even perfectly construe the other person's construction processes, it's a very small step to thinking that you know what's good for them. And I think that might explain that there's a surprising finding in some research I did with Sue Watson many years ago, where cognitive therapists rated their level of empathy in their therapeutic relationships as significantly higher than did personal construct therapists. And I think that was because the personal construct therapists viewed empathy and understanding of the other as something they constantly had to work on. They never felt that they were really there. So I think it's when sociality is combined with another personal construct process, hostility, that it's most likely to become noxious. Many of Kelly's diagnostic constructs are poorly understood, and you can see that if you look at descriptions of them in personality textbooks. The one that's most misunderstood, I think, is hostility, even in the use of it by personal construct psychologists. It's all too often used to refer to a process of simple, selective attention to evidence that validates your constructions, but not going beyond that to the crucial stage of extorting validational evidence for those constructions. And I think the effectiveness of hostility in extorting validational evidence is considerably enhanced if you have a degree of sociality with the person from whom you are extorting that evidence. So I'm going to give you a few examples of that process. Firstly, terrorism. A major aim of terrorism is not just to create terror, but to elicit from the objects of the terror reactions that validate the terrorists' constructions of those people. And I think a good example of this is Anders Breivik, the Norwegian mass murderer, who says that the European Islamic Ummah is our most potent weapon in our fight against the establishment. And he goes on to say that if Muslims are not validating your construction of them as being violent, then you can easily provoke them into being violent. The most efficient way of infuriating Muslims is to strike at their most prized possessions, their women, by carrying out what he calls deadly pinprick attacks. And this will incite them to engage in violent riots and various forms of jihadi activities prematurely. The media will have no choice but to cover it. The spiral will polarize societies. So you can see that Breivik is displaying a degree of sociality there in choosing the actions that are most likely to cause the other group to react in a way to validate his constructions. And like most terrorists, he is saying that he is wanting to trigger off a spiral of hostility. The people against whom terrorism is conducted are often only too willing to react in a way which does indeed validate the terrorists' constructions of them. And they engage in a vicious spiral of hostility of their own. So, for example, George Bush's war on terror, which arguably only had the effect of creating more terrorists, including the Frankenstein's monster of ISIS. And in doing that, it justified American punitive actions against those groups, validated the construction of them as violent, and the spiral continued. And this is something that hasn't just happened in the USA, it happens in other countries. For example, North African, Middle Eastern countries that are conducting their own wars on terror. One such country, Tunisia, the government has carried out repressive measures against Salafist Muslims, indiscriminate repressive measures, despite the fact that one group of Salafist Muslims are very much opposed to violence. In some research we did there with Edinburgh, we found evidence that those repressive measures were only serving to radicalize more and more people. was an interview with a young man. He and his friends were interrogated by the security forces because they were practicing their religion too devoutly. And he says, in our early 20s, we were a blank page. We knew nothing about Salafism or jihadism. We were only committed to practicing our prayers. But the security forces enlightened us about the existence of Salafism and jihadism. We were made Salafist by the police and their tough anti-terrorist regulations. First time I heard about Salafism was in the interrogation room, thanks to the interrogators who made us aware about how to struggle against oppression. We found something similar in Egypt. Again, an interviewee saying that the security apparatus has sponsored and encouraged the advocates of violent extremism to marginalise the influence of political Islam and to justify their own use of very punitive measures. Another country in which I've been doing some work recently on war survivors is Sri Lanka. And again, in Sri Lanka, that vicious cycle of hostility happened. The government carrying out brutal punitive measures which served to radicalise more people to join the Tamil Tigers, who carried out their own brutality in return. These sort of vicious sociality-aided cycles of hostility can also be apparent on a much smaller scale in interpersonal relationships. Doster has talked about them in relationships of domestic abuse, where each partner is trying to impose on the other invalidated constructions. And we're going to hear more about that, I think, later today from Precious Sidimedi, who's carried out research on paternal filicide, which really, some of that demonstrates the tragic consequences of those sort of vicious cycles of hostility. I don't know whether you're familiar with the play and film Gaslight. It's led to a term, gaslighting. In the play, a woman is subtly and insidiously caused to doubt her own sanity. And gaslighting is one of the items that's often in the repertoire of bullies. If we consider a workplace bully, this bears no relation to anyone. Someone of you might know that this is a man who is convinced that his version of reality is correct. He engages in hostility by arriving late for meetings or walking out of meetings, and then he uses the fact that issues are discussed when he's not there to validate his initial construction of him as a victim. This man is then thrust into a position of greater power where he can react to perceived slights by members of his staff by casting doubts on their competence. He denies them information. He ensures that they don't get invited to meetings. So, indeed, they can't do their job properly, they make mistakes, they come to doubt their own competence. So, process of hostility, validating his initial constructions of the world and of these people. Of course, Trump has to come into this. Probably no surprise that gaslighting has been used to describe Trump's behaviour. Pattern of saying or doing something and then denying it. situation where nothing means anything, reality is cancelled. There's confusion, there's chaos. Everything is upside down and inside out. But as we heard in the earlier presentation, Bill Clinton was no angel either. Gaslighting has been also used to describe the way in which the Clinton regime treated Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. The analysis is that gaslighting caused Newt to behave in a way which validated the Clinton regime's construction of him as a hysterical, manipulative individual. And we've heard about this other guy earlier. So the trading of insults between Trump and Kim Jong-un, at first sight, you wouldn't think there was much sociality involved in that. But I think, in fact, there was considerable sociality. In Trump's case, probably in the early hours of the morning, choosing the insult which would be most likely to provoke a reaction from the other that would validate your initial constructions of him. Trump, for example, probably wouldn't have taken very kindly to being called a dotard, not least because he probably had to look up the meaning of the word. Kim Jong-un, it would have been particularly provocative for him to be told that Trump's nuclear button is bigger and more powerful than his, and it works. But this is a dangerous game, so your sociality has to be very finely honed to keep below the threshold that the other person will react by pressing the nuclear button. Unless being correct is more important than survival. Kelly said, what the hostile man does not know is that it is he who is the eventual victim of his own extortion. And one has to hope that with these two, it's not just they who are going to be the victims, but also all of their citizens, as they triumphantly say, "I told you he was mad," in the few minutes that are left as the nuclear missile wends its way towards them. Torture, I think one of the clearest examples of a combination of sociality and hostility. So construing of the other person's construction processes enables you to choose the most excruciating and effective means of extracting information from them, which validates the torturer's view of the world. I don't know whether you know this guy, Comrade Douche. He was the commandant of the S-21 interrogation centre under the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia. And he makes it very clear that confessions that were induced under torture were in order to manufacture a new conception of the world. Didn't matter whether the confessions had any factual accuracy. All that mattered was that they validated the new conception of the world. When the confession was elicited, the torture victim was executed. Other people had been incriminated by the confession. They were brought into S-21, tortured and executed in turn. 14,000 people went through the gates of S-21, all but 7 of those were executed. Now, it might not surprise us that in devising methods of torture, governments turn to people who are meant to be experts on sociality, namely psychologists. What may be more surprising, even shocking, is that there are many psychologists who are only too willing to take on this role. And they did that at Guantanamo Bay. They were supported by the American Psychological Association, which refused to condemn their behavior as unethical. They developed regimes based on what was called reverse engineering, reversing the therapeutic process so that you're trying to increase rather than reduce distress. You probably know the regimes involved food deprivation, sleep deprivation, very loud noise, humiliation, violation of religious practices, and so forth. It's an example of a 17-year-old boy who told his interrogator that he was missing his family. He started crying. The interrogator asked the psychologist what they should do. The psychologist's response was that he should be told that his family had forgotten him. He should be isolated from anyone who spoke the same language. And not surprisingly, this boy attempted suicide just a few weeks later. But before we condemn, we may liken these psychologists to, for example, doctors who carried out medical experiments on people in Nazi concentration camps. But perhaps we should remember that even that paragon of empathy, Carl Rogers, was funded by the CIA. George Kelly, with his wife Gladys, set out in 1961 on a world tour, which is reported in his chapter Europe's Matrix of Decision. This is funded by the Human Ecology Fund. No problem with that, you might think, until you realise that the Human Ecology Fund is a front for the CIA. Heaven forbid, I'm not suggesting that George Kelly was engaged in nefarious activities on behalf of the CIA. And the CIA probably wouldn't have been very happy about his comments about inequality in the USA in that Europe's Matrix of Decision paper. But they might well have been very interested in what he said about the construction processes of other nations, particularly countries in the Soviet bloc, and what he said might have helped them in their role relationships with those countries. So all I'm saying is that we should watch out for uses of sociality for perhaps uncaring or noxious purposes. Just a few words about you might wonder how people who engage in these sort of acts, combining sociality and hostility, how do they deal with the guilt that might be provoked by those acts? The answer is that in many people there will be no guilt, because what they're doing is consistent with their core role. Comrade Douche made it very clear that I applied myself. I never violated discipline. So he was totally consistent with his core role. He did say that what did trouble him was that he discovered that some of his interrogators were using forms of torture, unlike things like electrocution of the genitals, eating excrement, vivisection. All of those were okay. But they were using some forms of torture which weren't on a codified list of tortures, so they weren't obeying the rules. And a very similar story with Rudolf Höss, commandant of Auschwitz. He presided over the murder of over 1 million people. He felt no guilt for that because he was acting totally in accordance with his core role of dutifully obeying orders, being a cog in the final solution of the Nazi regime. But he does say that he did feel guilt for learning that some of his staff ill-treated prisoners. So it's fine to gas them, fine to execute them, but not to ill-treat them, because that was against orders. If the torturers or terrorists' capacity for sociality is sufficient to allow a little bit of guilt to creep through, there are ways of dealing with that guilt. One way is to deny any commonality with your victims, dehumanizing them. And this is what happened with US Marine John Musgrave in Vietnam. He talked about being sick with guilt after he killed his first person in Vietnam. But then he worked out a way of dealing with it. He said, I only killed one human being in Vietnam. I made my deal with the devil and said that I will never kill another human being as long as I'm in Vietnam. However, I will waste as many gooks as I can find. I'll wax as many dinks as I can find. I'll smoke as many zips as I can find. But I ain't going to kill anybody. Turn a subject into an object. And it's presumably that same sort of process that allowed American soldiers in Vietnam to do things like playing gook hockey, where they placed bets on how many Vietnamese children they could hit with their vehicles. So this sort of dehumanization, of course, is very common in warfare, in situations of genocide. Comrade Deutsch referred to his detainees in S-21 as enemies, not men. The Nazis likened Jews to vermin. In Rwanda, the Hutu perpetrators of genocide referred to their Tutsi victims as cockroaches. But it's not only in situations of warfare. This is Katie Hopkins, a British journalist. She wrote an article entitled "Rescue Boats. I'd use gunships to stop migrants." And she wrote that she doesn't care if migrants die while trying to leave their countries by boat, because they're a plague of feral humans. Make no mistake, these migrants are cockroaches. Incidentally, the use of animal metaphors in these sort of dehumanizing descriptions implies that maltreatment of animals, and particularly of vermin, is acceptable. Again, because perhaps we deny any commonality with the construing of animals, or don't even see them as construing beings. So a further variant of dehumanization, Lieutenant Colonel Fred Swan, some of you may remember at the beginning of the Iraq War, there was a report that Saddam Hussein was eating in a restaurant. Lieutenant Colonel Fred Swan was sent to drop a bomb on that restaurant. The reports were mistaken. Saddam Hussein wasn't there. Many people were there, and were also in the apartments next to the restaurant that were destroyed. But he says, I didn't know who was there. I really didn't care. We've got to get the bombs on target. So you just fall totally into execute mode and kill the target. So note, killing a target, not killing a living being, or several people in this case. And then as warfare becomes more and more technological, death meted out by the launch of a drone is probably we're increasingly able to distance ourselves from the consequences of our actions. An American B-52 pilot in Vietnam says that very clearly. I never had to confront the consequences of my actions. There's a quote from Kelly talking about warfare as a hostile attempt to defend a particular construction of the world. Bombs must be dropped. To be sure, children will die, but who can say it was we who put them in the target area? And you'll have heard that sort of justification frequently in people talking about the dropping of bombs on schools and hospitals. It's happened in Gaza, it's happened in Jaffna, it's happened in Aleppo. Yeah, sure, children died, but we didn't put them there. They must have been put there as human shields. Okay, so to conclude, dear old Trevor Butt said that the sociality corollary provides an ethical basis for Kelly's thought. I guess I would argue that while it's necessary for ethical behaviour, it's not sufficient. And we need to combine sociality with an awareness of some commonality with the other person's construing. And indeed, simply seeing the other person as a construing being. I think it also requires what Kelly called a capacity for the acknowledgement of defeat if your constructions are invalidated. Acknowledging defeat rather than a hostile and even potentially murderous extortion from the other of evidence for those invalidated constructions. Thank you. I think we maybe have about 5 minutes for